one of the things that irritated missionaries was Native Americans like set their houses, their jacales, sometimes they might be called, their huts, in ways that didn't make sense to the Spanish mind. Like, this is not orderly. It's not in a grid. What are you doing? It was just a different sense of order. But so they were like, okay, missions, no more of you like putting things in like this, what looks to us in a random way. Like these things are going to be lined up like they should be in good European style.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Surf.
Our guest today is Jeremy Beer, who is a co-founder and the current Executive Chairman of American Philanthropic, now known as AmPhil. He is the former editor of ISI Books from 2000 to 2008, so it's great to have him back to ISI now to join our podcast. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. And Jeremy is the author of a number of books ranging in topics from nonprofit philanthropy to baseball to biographies of the saints, most recently Beyond the Devil's Road, Francisco Garcés, and the Spanish Encounter with the American Southwest, which he joins us to talk about today. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. How are things at ISI?
Very good.
Great.
You have this wide-ranging background, obviously PhD in psychology. Biography maybe lends itself well to that. You have maybe an insight into the human character and human nature. But why biography? You've worked at ISI, now doing work at AmPhil, writing on all these different topics. What made you want to delve into biography and history?
Yeah, it's a good question. It wasn't really some grand plan. I'm actually not sure that academic psychology does prepare you well to understand the human character, just to be clear. I think studying history and reading literature and probably studying like political philosophy, such as one encounters at ISI, probably prepares you better for that. But well, the great thing about biography is it's sort of a contained subject. You know what it is you need to know, and there's sort of not a potential of forever exploring it, the topic becoming so big that you can never sort of get your hands around it. So I think that's one thing that led me down this road. And also I just conceived, I don't know, probably when I was at ISI, a real interest in retrieving and recovering people from the dustbin of history who didn't deserve to have been cast there. And that's happened a lot. It always happens, I suppose. But as our kind of nation and culture took a more certain kinds of turns politically and socially, it left certain characters out of the conversation and out of the discussion. So it's fun to go back and retrieve them. And I know that's a lot of what you do at ISI, but what I've discovered is you can do that, beyond the bounds of sort of like, political sorts of discards. Yeah, there's just a lot of stories that haven't been told.
So why did you decide to tell Francisco Garcés' story? Are you from the Southwest, or how did you come across this specific character? Because whenever I think of the missionaries, I think the big name that anyone would really think of, especially in recent years, is Junipero Serra, right? So,
right.
But the figure that you chose to write about instead may have been someone that was kind of sidelined by history. But it sounds like he has a very a story that might have kind of been a redemptive one compared to, especially in the last several years. And the reason why I mentioned Junipero Serra was people might remember the headlines from years ago where his statue was like defaced at, and I think it was like in Northern California.
Multiple places in California, actually.
Exactly. So why did you choose Garcés to write about?
Yeah, so to the first part of your question, I'm not from the Southwest, but I live here now and I've lived here for 16 years. My wife is from Arizona and Phoenix. And in fact, we both worked at ISI and left ISI in part just to get back here to be where she's rooted and her family's been for a long time. So I think like many people, you moving to an entirely new place for me. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Indiana. You want to get your mind around where am I? What is this place? How did it come to be? What is the story of this place? So sort of delving into Southwestern history, it's very fascinating. And in so doing, came across the name of Francisco Garcés. He's a character. The only other book that really kind of foregrounds him as a character is a book called Franciscan Frontiersmen, which I found at a random independent bookstore in San Diego. It was written by a former journalist. Very good book. I'd recommend it highly. And Garcés just leaps off the page as somebody who should be better known. It was clear he was an extraordinarily courageous explorer, number one, clearly one of the greatest explorers in the history of the continental United States. And also, though, really admirable, somebody who had the ability to connect in a fruitful way with Native Americans. There was sort of no violence attached to his missionary work, at least that he was implicated in perpetrating. Not that I'm accusing Sarah or anybody else of sort of, untoward violence, but that's the charge that's laid against him, as you were saying, Marlo. So he just jumped off the pages as somebody who is worth knowing, and there was no biography of him. So I realized I was going to have, if I wanted to know him, I was going to have to write it myself. He knew Sarah, by the way, so just to make that connection. So you said, yes, the only sort of person most people might know who was associated with the Spanish colonization of or encounter with the American Southwest typically is Junipero Serra. Garcés, just to kind of place this in context for people, Serra is working along the California coast. He comes up, he and a group of other Franciscans come up from Baja California as part of the Sacred Expedition in 1769 to found a mission at San Diego and then in Monterey and then eventually places in between. At the same time, Garcés and a different group of Franciscans were posted in what is today northern Sonora and southern Arizona. And Garcés was posted at a place called San Xavier del Bac, or San Javier del Bac, if we want to be more appropriate with our Spanish. Some listeners may know that place. It's just a few miles south of Tucson. Today, there's one of the most beautiful missions, probably the most beautiful mission still standing in the American Southwest is there. That was built after Garcés was there. And that was the most exposed place in the entire frontier of the northern New Spain's northern frontier. Incredibly dangerous place. And that made it all the more interesting to want to know more about this guy who started at a very dangerous place, the most dangerous place on that frontier, and decided, I'm going to go further on my own with no arms, with no soldier guard, with no water, no food, in the hottest desert on the continent. It's just an amazing, amazing story and somebody you just are drawn to.
Jeremy, as you were thinking about writing this biography, delving into this person's history, what was your approach to research? The book, it sounded like you worked with someone to help map out where exactly he was traveling on his missions. Was this, were you traveling and walking the same roads? What was the whole experience of researching and trying to figure things out?
So the first thing was I really wanted, and the other reason I wanted to do this was I really wanted to know for myself in the context of the statues being defaced, as you were saying, Marlo, and toppled in that great iconoclastic spasm of 2020. I wanted to know for myself, what was the relationship like between the Franciscan missionaries who worked in the American Southwest, and other missionaries for that matter too, and Native groups. So that's number one. So my research started there. What's the best scholarly research tell us? And then, you had to dive into the primary sources. So Garcés left behind. The great thing about the Spanish Empire was that it was highly bureaucratic. That's the great thing for historians, if not for people who lived there or were officials within that empire. And so they left. Everything was written down, and often in duplicate and triplicate. And so we have 5 diaries from Garcés, and lots of letters to and from him, and then from other people around him. So the research entailed getting into all of that. Fortunately, a lot of it had already been translated into English, if not published in English. Much of it has not been published in English. It entailed me finding some dragooning some great Spanish translators into helping me make some sense of documents and translate some documents for me. And then to your point, Tom, Yes, I worked with a man here in Phoenix, it turns out, who is an expert cartographer and had interest and expertise in, what would you say, early American cartography of this area. So he helped me figure out routes, where Garces went, a lot of the diaries. I mean, when you're traveling an unknown, unmapped wilderness, you're not exact with nothing's named yet. So trying to figure out where he is, as he says, where he's going is not always easy. And this man Tom Jonas really helped me with that. And yeah, it entailed traveling on his roads as much as I could. Because I wrote most of this during COVID, it was hard to get into Mexico. And there were some other reasons not to do a whole lot of traveling in northern Sonora in the last few years. Not that it can't be done, but it's a little dangerous. So as much as I could, yes. So it involved traveling, mapping, figuring out routes, getting into archives, and also trying to situate all that within a reasonable, non-ideological understanding of what the encounter of the missionaries and Native American groups was like.
So we scraped the surface a little bit of the legacy of the missionaries, regarding, the mass just the attacks that whether it was like spilling paint on statues of like Junipero Cerro during I think it was like 2020. But the legacy of the missionaries in the West has been heavily scrutinized in recent years, especially the dynamic between the Spanish missionaries and natives. But as you mentioned earlier, it sounds like Garces seems to have had a friendlier relationship with the Indians that he encountered, and maybe that had set him apart. So could you talk more about that, what that dynamic looked like, and different ways that maybe as you were writing this piece and comparing maybe other missionaries and missions that were in what is now the U.S., how that maybe stuck out to you or was distinguished?
A great question. Of course, the answer is it's really complicated. It's really complicated. It's not simple. This isn't a cartoon with simple heroes and villains. Um, the most extreme charges against the missionaries in California and the rest of the Southwest, like as a group that they were guilty of genocide, those are not sustainable charges to any reasonable person. Not least because they had zero intent to do anything like that. They wanted to. They were very distressed when they saw native populations decreasing and didn't understand why. Whether we can hold them account to not diving deep. I mean, they certainly were incentivized not to give up the missions. This isn't working and go home. Maybe that would have been the more heroic thing to do in some cases. They didn't do that. But so those most extreme charges are not true. It's also true that Native Americans were often attracted to the missions for material reasons, and the missionaries knew that. They knew that a consistent supply of food was attractive. They knew that clothes were attractive, especially for Native women, and other tools and useful things and pretty things. Things were amazing, like compasses and stuff like that. Were guns, of course. Although in Spain they were pretty careful about not letting Native Americans get guns if they could help it. On the other hand, it's also true that sometimes there wasn't much choice. So if a mission got started in California, and once the herd started to multiply, and the cows and the sheep and the goats are roaming the countryside, eating native crops and herbs, and not crops, but things that they would gather, right, for their sustenance, well, you're kind of forcing them into the mission because there's little choice left. So that's what I mean by it's kind of complicated. Garces, number one, was not a builder. He wasn't very good at administrating or building missions, and wasn't interested in it. He was interested in exploring and meeting Native American groups where they were and figuring out what their posture was towards Christianity and the Spanish, and making peace between various peoples and preaching the gospel. So he's because he wasn't much of an administrator and didn't stay at his home mission very much. He didn't even have he wasn't saddled with some of the same responsibilities that someone like Sarah was. At the same time, he also did intuit that aspects of the missionary enterprise needed to change. So oftentimes you'll read priests. There were bad priests, by the way, like there are today, like there have always been. Um, and sometimes they were just really dense missionaries who would come in and say, "Look, we're coming in. You're going to want to uh, join the mission, and once you do, everything's going to change. You've got to, you're going to have to completely get rid of every custom and way you've ever known, and live according to our rules." And Garces thought that was a really, really dumb way to go about things. He thought you should be more gentle and patient, and not enter with a big show of force. And generally, he lived that. And B, he was very comfortable living as Native Americans lived, eating what they ate, sitting how they sat, sitting around the fire in the way that they would want to do late into the night, and so forth. So he just had it was a much more diplomatic and sort of I don't know, empathic soul, I think we can say that. So that's a long and maybe convoluted answer to your question, Marlo, but that's the kind of thing you get into here. Like, it was a complicated dynamics. The most extreme charges against the missionaries are not sustainable, and they definitely couldn't be sustained against Garces, who was kind of a model of encounter as it was available to people at that time.
And how did would you say that encounter and the type of maybe the gentle spiritedness, I guess, of his presence, was that a force for evangelization,
Yeah.
evangelization in
Yeah.
a way that perhaps was particularly particularly potent, that was very receptive by the
Yeah.
natives that he was around?
It's a good question. So it's always hard to know at the time in the history, and this is one thing that contemporary scholars will emphasize, like, well, is there any real interest in Christianity here to the extent they can even understand what the heck it is you're talking about? Or is this what looks to be an openness on the part of native groups, just openness to, like, yes, we'd love to have soldiers around here and missionaries to give us food and protection against our enemies, because there's constant warfare at the time among native groups. So it's hard to know is the question, but there appears to be, right? If you read the sources, and this goes way back well before Garces into the 15 and 1600s, early 1700s, as Spanish make their way northward from Mexico City after the conquest of the Aztecs. There seems to be in various cases real, genuine, what you almost call theological openness and interest among various Native American groups and what they're hearing. And I think you see that at times with Garces. There were certainly people who responded. So, for example, the man who was sort of the head man, the chief of the Quechan Indians, called the Yumas at the time by the Spanish, at Yuma, today's Yuma, Arizona, was named Salvador Palma in Spanish. That's what he went by in Spanish. He was appeared to be so interested in what he heard, and that he asked to be taken to Mexico City. He wanted to see for himself what the civilization looked like at its apex, and he was baptized and confirmed in Mexico, and came back to Yuma. Now, was that just to kind of gain prestige among his people? Was it just to cement his relationship with the Spaniards, or was he really interested in, with the evangelization, kind of, was it potent in his case, to use your terminology? We don't know, because Salvador Palma left us, we have one testimony from him before he was baptized in Mexico City, but it went through like a couple of translators before it gets written down, and just who knows what he really said and why he was saying what he said and what we have. But I think in some cases there was. And I'll answer your question one more thing. The percentage of Americans who are Catholic is 20% today. Do you know what the percentage of Native Americans in America who are Catholic today is? 20%. 20%.
I'm sorry, what was it?
20%. It's
Oh,
exactly the
wow.
same.
I could have sworn I saw a statistic that said it was 33% of Americans. So is 20 the accurate percentage?
I
Or
think so,
okay,
Catholic, yeah. But
okay.
if I'm wrong, you put that in the show notes. Jeremy Beer quoted wrong percentage. But that, I think I'm right on that. Now, the percentage where Garces worked in Southwest Arizona, today's Southwest Arizona, the two people, the Odom people were called the Pimas and the Papagos at that time. and still often today, were those whom he worked, and they manifested a great interest in the missions, and they were always friendly, always sort of alive with Spanish, and later even with the Anglo-Americans who came across. They today, the Tohono O'odham Nation is probably the most Catholic place in America. It's 80 to 90% Catholic. And the Acamel O'odham, the river Pima Indians along the Gila River, is about 50%. Most of the rest of the 50% are Baptist, by the way. So there is evidence of potency of evangelization, and there's certainly no evidence to suggest that Native Americans are less interested as a whole in Christianity than are other peoples of different ethnicities. But sometimes contemporary scholars don't like that fact.
And Jeremy, as you were explaining in the last few questions, I'm noticing a distinction between evangelization, which is conversion, protection, and salvation of souls on the one hand, and then the larger missionary goals of, I think, maybe colonization, but I would describe it as more a political thing.
Correct.
And we today think about the temporal and the spiritual orders being separate, but at the time there is no separation of church and state. There's a distinction, but there's always some sort of
a distinction, but not separation.
Of the two things.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could speak to more of that distinction and how the two things are interplaying. And then maybe you could even speak to like the larger political context of colonization and great power conflict over the New World. Things like that.
It's interesting. So Spain always had, you're right, to the Spanish mind in the mid to late 1700s, which is what we're talking about. Just to make it clear for people, Garcés was active 1768 to 1781 on the frontier. There is a distinction, but not a separation between church and state. It's not even thinkable for there to be a separation. They're two sides of the same coin. So the goals with the missions, from the point of view of the Spanish crown, were to do two things: to make Native Americans Christians, thus saving their souls, and to make them Hispanicized, thus making them good citizens. And those things go together. And the missions and missionaries saw themselves as agents in that process in both senses. They could not think like, well, we'll Christianize them, but forget about Hispanicizing them. Now, they did want to protect Native Americans. They had a very paternalistic view. This is one thing that kind of rankles today if you read this. Like it's just frankly paternalistic in a kind of more medieval than modern way. But this is how they thought. Like, when they protect them from the evil forces of secular society and from being exploited by miners, ranchers, from being violently sexually assaulted by soldiers, for example. One of the issues and problems that Sarah had to deal with in California. And so they did try to keep them away, Native Americans away from Spanish society in a way, at the same time as they were supposed to be agents of Hispanicization. And they certainly didn't, like a mission, like one of the things that irritated missionaries was Native Americans like set their houses, their jacales, sometimes they might be called, their huts, in ways that didn't make sense to the Spanish mind. Like, this is not orderly, it's not in a grid, what are you doing? It was just a different sense of order. But so they were like, okay, missions, no more of you like putting things in like this, what looks to us in a random way. Like these things are going to be lined up like they should be in good European style. So it's definitely two sides. They went together for sure, and that's part of one of the limitations in perspective that we can look back on now, maybe with some justification, and see. In terms of the great power stuff, Spain was involved in various, supported the American side because of the rivalry with the English in the American Revolution, and then kind of got embroiled in that before they had been embroiled in what we know as the French and Indian Wars. That limited the amount of resources that Spain could devote to the frontier. So again, we're talking today around like where the international border line is between Mexico and the United States, give or take a couple hundred miles. And so there were never enough soldiers on the frontier to really secure it. And so it was made it difficult for missionaries who were posted there to do their work. Some missionaries responded by staying in the mission with a few soldiers or nearby presidio and not venturing very far afoot for fear mainly of the Apaches, but also some other Native American groups. And others like Garcés, just were incredible. That's what makes him so incredibly courageous, is his willing to undertake solo journeys of hundreds to thousands of miles in that context. But the great power thing, to your point, made it that it was not very secure and also not very settled. That Spain, in part, just because you're trying to settle the entirety of the North and South American continents, more or less, there's just not that many Spaniards. So a lot of places are thinly settled, and that's why California and the rest of the Southwest were as sparsely settled as they were by the time the Anglo-Americans came across the mountains.
So just taking this, I want to zoom out a little bit because I want to better understand from your perspective, especially you mentioned earlier that you're actually not a native of the Southwest. You're from the Midwest, and Tom and I as well. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Tom's from the Northeast, from New England, and I want to ask you, what do you think is important for those of us not from the region, but especially places that are far separated from that region, to understand about the landscape of the Southwest,
Yeah.
and how the missionaries influenced it, the Spanish influence, and how they shaped it, whether it's culturally or even economically?
That's a great question. First of all, you should visit Southwest, the most beautiful and amazing place in our country. No offense to my friends back in Indiana. Well, first thing, just imaginatively, I think it's to change your imagination about how the America was settled by Europeans from strictly an east to west thing, and make room for a south to north part of that story. There's also a north to south part of that story with New France and the French, which we also don't think about very much, but coming down the Great Lakes into the river valleys and so forth. But we should imagine that when we think about the European settlement of America, we should think of all three of those movements together. And yes, one is much more dynamic than the others. The Anglo-American, English and everything that follows in its wake effort at settlement is much more dynamic. The numbers are way larger, and that's the winner, right? But that's one thing to keep in mind, because that did happen. There was European settlement from the south. It left its mark on the land from a nomenclature perspective. It's dramatic, right? I mean, that's the big difference. If you're looking at a map of the Southwest or driving around, so many place names are in Spanish. California has a cultural component that's real. It's revived in the late 19th and early 20th century in a kind of a bit of a commercialistic way. If you've been to Santa Barbara, Santa Barbara looks like it looks because it was intended to be built like what later Americans wanted Spanish California to have looked like. So there's kind of a complicated thing going on there. But certainly the architectural heritage is important and genuine. There's a heritage of just dealing with an arid place. Everything changes after west of the 100th meridian. And one thing that we got wrong was in applying the same sorts of land use and land, I guess land use is the right word, sort of laws to the arid Southwest that work in the moist Northeast and Midwest. Spain had a different understanding, and that actually is still reflected in many laws in the Southwest about water rights and things like that. But yeah, I think generally thinking of this, the settlement of America and the American story, as one that includes an important Spanish component and therefore an important sort of Catholic component that isn't as present in the typical story, the old story, say the pre-1619 project story. I don't know, so the more traditional story, I think is very useful, and it's a complexifying in a healthy way. I don't know if that answers your question, Marlo. That was a good one.
Yeah, and I guess maybe I'll throw in another question that might draw from that, because you mentioned the imagination of how we we think about the Southwest. And the first thing that comes to mind for me was when I think of the Southwest, I especially think of just shifting to my literature background a little bit. I think of
Mhm.
like Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, but also Willa Cather's Death
Yeah.
Comes from Archbishop. And, both these books, they describe the terrain of the region and its harshness, but Cather, she especially evokes kind of the stillness in almost a soothing way that I feel like
Yeah.
is very distinct to the region, just
Yes.
having been to, even for like the Phoenix area, surrounding Phoenix area,
Yeah.
there's like or even when I've been to like Nevada, it's like this vast desert that is
Right.
so foreign to
Yeah.
me being from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Um, so you see this patchwork too of like these different cultures, whether it's like various American Indian tribes or the former Spanish or Mexican empires. You mentioned the use of Spanish names for various cities. But how does Garces and the Spanish mission in particular, do you think, fit into this like mythology of the Southwest, whether it's evoked in literature? I'm sure anyone listening to the podcast who enjoys Westerns perhaps is
Yeah.
seen this mythology in play and in different, different ways through film. But what would you say is the kind of how does that fit into this larger imagination and mythology?
First of all, I'll say you're absolutely right about the sense of space being completely different in the Southwest. It is sort of an epic landscape. It's made for epics like the sort of really great myths that sprung up quickly around like the frontier West, the American West, the gunslinger, cowboys, and Indian stuff. It's really the landscape is just made for that. Um, and yes, the sense of vastness. I think of it as like an Augustinian sense of your smallness in the largeness of the world is always kind of borne in upon you. It's the opposite of like um, Hobbitian sort of the world of coziness. It's the least cozy place, in America. Um, but about the mythology, how does this all fit into sort of the mythology? Um, the missionaries don't enter Willa Cather's death comes the Archbishop aside. They're not a big part of the myth that we tell ourselves, are they? They're a counterpoint. They're a countercurrent. They're used early on to shame Anglo-Americans for their treatment of Native Americans. They're a counterpoint. Like, look what you've done. You've engaged on a project of extermination and continual, breaking of treaties and moving people rather than an attempt to Christianize and civilize. That kind of narrative grows up in the late 19th century. Before that, they are, if you read, Richard, is it Dana? His 3 years before the Mass. I think it's 3 years before the Mass. On some other accounts of English and American travelers to California, they're an exotic counterpoint to Puritan and sort of Northeastern culture. They sort of, at that point, the missions are flourishing, and there's this sort of patriarchal medieval civilization, happening over on the other side of the continent. It's really, really weird, and it's exotic, and it's Catholic versus Puritan and so forth. So they fit in these kind of counterpoint ways, I would say, the missions themselves, the missionaries, as a different way to have organized society, a different way to have approached the Native American peoples, and so I think it's interesting from that standpoint. And then later, of course, in the early 20th century, really by the 30s or 40s, they fall very much out of favor. There's the first the first time genocide is used potentially to describe what the missions were really engaged in. It's very early on. Comes up, and then they just become sort of like retrograde, shameful European rather than just Spanish symbol of everything that's wrong with the West. So I think they fit in that kind of counterpoint kind of way, if that makes sense.
Maybe as a counterpoint to the counterpoint, I wonder if you have any stories that you think are very compelling about Garcés's life. I mean, if they want all of the stories, they can read the book, but are
Yeah.
there any sort of trenchant stories or adventures and encounters that he has that you just think are both emblematic of him, but maybe give a, like I said, like a counterpoint to the counterpoint narrative.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, yeah, he's um, there are lots of stories, as you say, and you can read the book a lot. Encounters with um, hostile Indians, very welcoming, much more very welcoming um, Native Americans. But the most, the adventure part of this, the exploration part of it's just very compelling and interesting. We are this year through 2026, we'll celebrate, not that almost anybody outside the Southwest would ever know, the 250th anniversary of a very famous expedition. It's called the Anza expedition. That's Juan Bautista de Anza who led it. There were actually two Anza expeditions, and they are what led to the settlement with civilians of California. And so what's just very, to your point, interesting story is how Garcés made that all possible. It's funny to think about now, but the Spanish didn't know how to get from today's northern Mexico, Sonora, across these very forbidding deserts to the coast of California, other than sailing around Baja California and coming back up and coming to port in San Diego or Monterey, whatever, which is a very dangerous and very long and very scurvy-filled journey, oftentimes by the time it ended. So, but they didn't really know how to get across on foot. So that's Garcés. One of his great contributions is he figured that out, did it on his own. He gets terribly lost. And what's so compelling and what's so just like interesting is that, again, it's not all violence and turpitude. The story of the encounter of Europeans and native groups is not all violence and turpitude. The amazing generosity and charity shown him by the various native groups he encounters, and how they communicate with each other and try to figure each other out, but yet treating with incredible hospitality is just, it's remarkable to me. It's so not to be corny, but it's kind of uplifting. It's sort of it's a good counterpoint to your inner Calvinist that says all people are or your inner Hobbesian. It's like that. The Franciscans weren't totally wrong. There is some inner goodness to human beings, and Garcés would often encounter that. So I think that's what I think of it. And then people should know he made an incredible solo journey, solo with various Native American guides at different times. There's probably the most incredible kind of journey of its kind in American history. He's the first European into today's Nevada, one of the first into the large chunks of California, the first to enter the Grand Canyon from the west, the first to descend to the village of Supai, which is still today one of the most remote villages in the United States, and like a 2,000-mile, 10-month deal on his own that is just unparalleled. And so just reading that story on its own and all the different groups he encounters and the things he sees and things he's figuring out in this unknown wilderness makes for a very, very good reading.
So I'm asking this as a Catholic, and just based off of your research into, the influence of missionaries in the Southwest, I know, especially in having kind of a Eastern, I guess, centric vision of American Catholicism that largely is informed by, the American Catholics that came to the U.S., particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. What would you say that, aside from the Catholics who helped shape the American Church, in the U.S. in that time period, primarily throughout the Northeast and the East Coast, how would you say that the Catholic roots that were placed in the time of the Spanish missionaries can help us think more about the Church and Catholic identity through the lens of some of that Spanish influence, whether it was through Garcés and his peers who were Spanish missionaries?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say first there's a very it is a story and tradition, a legacy that's absolutely worth mostly being proud of. Not that there aren't abuses, there are. Not that everybody was a great hero, they weren't, but they were great heroes. There were a lot of selfless people involved, almost all men, at this time anyway. And it's a absolutely retrievable legacy. Do we want, would we be happy today with sort of the strong paternalism of the missions? No, of course not. But the intention was actually almost always very good, and often had good results for everybody involved. So I think it's a retrievable legacy, I guess I would say. It's it's one marked by great self-sacrifice and really incredible self-sacrifice and suffering. Um, and to know it is to kind of, in many cases, again, not all, in many cases, to find people who are worthy of emulation and respect and admiration. Garcés being, I think, with Sarah and a couple of others, chief among them. There is another explorer from that perspective, Marlo, people might want to know. His name was Eusebio Kino. Arizonans know him because there are various Kino things around here. First to European to enter, well, after Coronado and some others, for the first kind of missionary to enter Arizona. That was the late 1600s, early 1700s. He's also, his cause for canonization is being advanced. I think he was just called named venerable or elevated to the status of venerable a couple years ago. So there are others that are here. Their stories are worth being known as much as somebody like Elizabeth Seton, Saint Elizabeth Seton, might be known in the Northeast. But it's a more of it's a rugged and explorer kind of story, oftentimes more than it is a sort of immigrant, urban story.
Well, Jeremy, I think you've just given us a great note on which to end. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us about who sounds like a great man, and the book is Beyond the Devil's Road for our listeners and viewers. They can go pick that up wherever books are found, right, Jeremy?
That is correct. Yep.
But recommended, and if there people want to follow more of your other work, keep up with what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm not on social media, so I'm on LinkedIn, so I post stuff on there. That's the one thing the one concession I've made to our times. But yeah, thanks.
All right, very good. LinkedIn. Thanks again, Jeremy.
Appreciate it.